Welcome to Brain in a Vat. Today we have Tom Angier, who is based at the University of Cape Town, but is currently on sabbatical at Oxford. Tom's interests are in moral philosophy, and we're going to be talking about evil today. Tom, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
A ring is available to somebody which makes them invisible. And if you put this ring on, nobody can see you, and you can effectively, therefore, do anything you please because nobody can catch you. And the thought experiment's very simple but quite profound, which is, what would you do if you were given such a ring? The person in the dialogue, or the narrative that's reported in the dialogue, decides to do all kinds of nefarious things, like sleep with a wife of the king, steal various things, and then make off with the booty. So he takes it that the ring allows impunity, kind of at least no consequences for one's action, and therefore sets him at liberty to do what he feels like. So it's a very sharp thought experiment which highlights to what degree we do the right thing because otherwise we'll be punished, and to what degree do we do the right thing because it's the right thing.
So Tom, what's the answer? So is evil part of our nature, or is it something that and that we need some kind of external force to stop us from enacting? Is it some kind of original sin part of us, or is it something else?
Yeah, well, if I had the answer to that, I'd be quite rich. I think you're definitely asking a pertinent question. That's the one we all have to think about. I think one thing to say is that as children, as certainly as infants, we tend to only do the right thing in virtue of certain incentives and certain rewards and punishments. That's how we're trained, as it were, morally at the outset. And what the Ring of Gyges is suggesting is that we're all still at heart like moral infants. As soon as the punishments are lifted, we do what we feel like. To what degree do we always have to contend with an underlying moral child in us? To what degree do we ever fully overcome that kind of attitude to moral action? My view would be that it's a struggle. It's probably a temptation that remains with us. But to the degree that we're morally mature, we have internal resources that can overcome such inducements, if you like. But it's always going to be a struggle to one degree or another. We're never fully morally mature.
So there's a really striking modern example of the Ring of Gyges, which is the ability to say things online anonymously. So you slip on the ring, no one knows who you are, and you find that anonymous accounts tend to do things that no one would do in polite company. So they're very abusive. They'll sling insults. They'll call on someone to have their job taken away from them. They will try and destroy someone else because they have this this Ring of Gyges, this sort of sense of anonymity.
Yeah.
This is social media accounts, Mark. This is Facebook, Twitter. You're talking about
exactly.
Yeah.
So that ability to sort of transact without consequence, because no one will know who's really behind the attack, seems to bring out, as you say, that moral childishness.
Yes.
You don't have a sense of, well, I should do what is right for what's right's sake, but I should do things to my own benefit and to my own delight and to the suffering of others if I can get away with it.
Yeah. Well, that's very revealing. I hadn't thought of the connection there, because I've been very exercised by this for me, new phenomenon, given I'm so old. I was that around a long time before the internet. And I think that what shocked me in particular is how irresponsible a medium social media can be. It encourages a kind of, I've thought of it as a kind of adolescent mentality, but in fact it's probably worse than that. It's probably a deeply infantile mentality of acting as one pleases in virtue of the lack of consequence for that action. And I was moved a couple of perhaps this time last year to come up with a series of do's and don'ts for behavior on the social media, and I wrote out a list. One of my recommendations was that you shouldn't respond to any felt offense or slight on the internet before a day had passed.
Well, that would just take the wind out of everyone's sails.
Yeah, quite. That's part of the point.
There'd be no more of it. That'd be it.
Yeah, exactly, because it depends on this sort of very quick fire retorts and stuff. And somebody said, well, that gives people a free pass to insult, as if we're obliged to constantly monitor other people's behavior. This is called call-out culture, isn't it? It's very disturbing. There's no such obligation to call people out. But I think it changes behaviors in profoundly worrying ways. I've seen the most, educated, the most cultured people, nominally, behave in ways which are, frankly, sort of you never expect from them in conversation or in personal relations. They take on a new personality, which I think shows the Gyges problem firsthand. Yeah.
So is this other personality, this alter ego, the personality once you've got the Gyges ring on, or you're anonymous online or relatively anonymous online, is that our true nature? Is the thought experiment meant to bring out who we really are underneath? Or is there a different way of looking at it, that perhaps that's not who we really are? Perhaps who we really are is, once we do have our real face on, at least our face that everyone can see, and we take the ring off, is that who we really
are? You're asking a metaphysical question about human nature, which is, I think, one of the most difficult to answer. So the biblical account of man's fall, it's a very ambiguous tale, but what I think has great riches. One reading of that is that we're all profoundly sinful, and that we sort of, in some sense, inherit an indelible tendency to misbehavior. And that's the most profound thing you could say about us, that we're at root evil. And that's our default. I actually think that's a misreading of the Genesis story. I think the actual significance of that story is that at root, we seek the good and we want to do the good. But there is some terrible flaw which is conveyed by the eating of the apple, etc., which intervenes and, if you like, as it were, mars or blemishes our nature. And it's that wounded aspect of us, as it's sometimes called, the wound of original sin, which betrays our true nature and gets in the way of what we truly desire, truly seek. So it's a nuanced view, I think. It's neither we're basically evil or we're basically good. It's rather that we're a strange concoction, perhaps with one taking precedence in some sense. But nonetheless, there's a dialectic between the two, and we're always at odds with that temptation to do the wrong thing.
I think what's interesting is you point out that we've got these two different urges inside of us,
Yeah.
and that our setting might play a role in what comes out. And so, being anonymous or being invisible makes it so much easier for that evil instinct to come out. In Orthodox Judaism, they refer to it as the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination.
Yes.
And you've kind of got that sitting on your shoulder here, and you've got the good inclination here. Your response is interesting on social media, which is one of saying, well, I'm going to take time out to reflect, which seems to draw on a kind of particular virtue, let's say, of patience. And I wonder, in other words, you describe this as a set of rules, but maybe it's not a set of rules, it's a set of character traits.
Unlike someone like Kant or various modern philosophers, the virtues don't give you blueprints for action. What they give is a set of dispositions which should be brought to bear on any context of action, so that there's no algorithm, there's no decision procedure for action. There's just a set of considerations, if you like. What would the virtuous person do? I'm sympathetic to it. I also think that it's compatible with certain rules or laws of action. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So, for instance, someone like Aristotle and even Aquinas in the medieval period thought that there were certain hard and fast moral rules of action, certain do's and don'ts. And the virtues helped us to discern when those rules should be applied and which rules were relevant to a particular situation. Yeah. So in my view, that it's wrong to view virtue as an exclusive guide to the moral life. It's a part of the mix, very helpful part. Yeah.
So I wonder whether evil should be seen as something. I mean, originally you talked about it as intrinsic to us, and you kind of talked about it as if it's, at least on some accounts, as if it's sort of our base state. So on certain accounts, it would be, you talked about like moral infancy, or moral being the moral child in us, or as Mark said, the Yetzer Hara, which is the Jewish conception of evil as sitting on your shoulder.
Right.
A lot of
evil angel, or the devil on your shoulder. Yeah.
And that's part of us and in us. And then you and Mark have discussed this virtue and vice account. So evil would be an absence of virtues or a presence of vices, maybe, which would be part of your character. But as the resident utilitarian, I have kind of a different intuition about evil, which might not be coherent. So you need to correct me here. But the intuition I have is that evil isn't something you are, it's something you do. So it's based in actions. So the idea wouldn't be that you are evil, but your actions are evil. And if you accrue enough evil actions, well, then perhaps you have a negative utility value. But only when we say that you have a negative utility value, or you produce more suffering than good in the world, or happiness in the world, what we really mean is you are doing bad things, but not that you are bad. And as a utilitarian, I would lean towards that kind of conception.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as utilitarianism, consequentialism has focused on action and the consequences of action, I think that's right as an account. But of course, there are other versions of utilitarianism, I think, which say that character is a feature of the utilitarian calculus, right? So as it were, you should be expanding your view to include, as it were, character, because it matters, as it were, what the consequences for your character are too. And to me, that's quite plausible, because to deny that character exists, or that it has any intrinsic value, seems to me implausible. It goes against what Aristotle would call the moral phenomena, because we tend to take people's character quite seriously. But I also concede to the utilitarian, perhaps you, that the action is central in the moral life in many ways. It's that which joins us up, as it were, to other people. It's that which affects other people. And someone like Aristotle is very clear that we only generate our character, that is, our traits, through action. If we didn't act, then we wouldn't develop a character. So he says famously that we develop traits through like actions. So if you want to become courageous, the only way to do it is by doing courageous things. You're not going to, as it were, magically develop a certain character without acting. I think that's very profound.
So Aristotle's account of virtue is that a virtue sits in the mean between the two vices. So on courage, he says, it's between foolhardiness on the one hand and cowardice on the other. And he thinks that if you have the one vice, if you are a coward, you can stray more into the foolhardy territory to kind of push yourself along this line. Now, often moral philosophers are very interested in virtues and, trying to work out what should one do to be good, to be virtuous. But today we're talking about evil. So can we talk a bit about some of those vices? What are the key vices? If someone wanted to be the next Dr. Evil, what would they do to become very evil?
Mark wants a how-to guide.
That's right, the Bluffer's Guide to Vice. Very good. Yeah. Good question. And it's a telling question, because the inquiry in this area almost always takes virtue as primary. So we talk about the cardinal virtues. We don't talk about the cardinal vices. So in some sense, most moral philosophers taking the virtues to be the starting point, and vices to be a derogation from virtue, a lack of virtue, as opposed to something positive in its own right. That's a long-standing view. The trouble is with that view is that the effects of vice seem to be very real and to be almost more, they impinge more on our consciousness often than the effects of virtue. People remember bad stuff more than they remember good stuff often. So I think there's a problem there for the traditional view. As to what the main vices are, Aristotle would probably say a lack of wisdom. So one of the worst things is to have not been given the wherewithal to make moral judgment, to grow up in an environment where vice becomes inevitable because one hasn't been introduced to the materials of virtue, if you like. So if you think about, for instance, the famous cases of children killing other children, and that shocks people to the core. They seem that they often say the most evil thing you could imagine, killing a child. But certainly if that's done by other children, it's often not a mark of vice. It's a mark of ignorance. And they're probably far less to blame than we think.
So you think that ignorance is kind of the core vice? It's the vice from which others stem?
Socrates thought that all vice reduced to ignorance and all virtue reduced to knowledge. When I characterized Aristotle earlier on, it was slightly misleading. He takes it that Socrates was on the right track but didn't quite make it. Almost for Socrates, vice is a form of how should you put it, an intellectually empty state. It's something that we're not grasping. So there's knowledge which would, as it would tell us how to act, and we lack that knowledge, and therefore we're driven by desires and various other impulses to veer off the right track. It seems to me that most people think, strong intuition I think a lot of people have, that vice is a bit more substantial than mere ignorance. You have to add in this brew of disposition. As it were, a character trait is not reducible just to an intellectually null state. It's actually a shaping of our behavior and our character in such a way that we go wrong in certain ways. Not that there isn't an intellectual element to that. Right? There is an intellectual element to that, but that's not the whole story. There's, as it were, a behavioral and a dispositional aspect as well.
So you gave an example of something that people consider supremely evil, like the killing of an innocent child. And part of your way around that is to say, well, it depends who perpetrates it. In other words, we want to look at how much of an agent the killer is, and that helps us assign how evil they are. That it might have to do with their capacity or their circumstances. The other kind of supreme evil that people think about is where you have someone who pits two innocents against each other. So there's a horror movie called Saw, and it starts off with these two innocents have been abducted and they're in a room, and in order to escape, the one has to kill the other. I think there's like a key hidden inside of the guy's heart or something, and he has to cut him open and kill him.
Yeah.
And you find these examples throughout history as well, where you had the capos in Nazi Germany. So they were Jews whose job it was to round up other Jews, and this idea that you take someone who is themselves innocent and you corrupt the situation, you corrupt the environment so that they themselves act in an evil manner.
Yes. Right. So that's a sort of hell that we've created as adults. Indeed. So, I mean, just to, since we live in South Africa, it seems to me that something analogous was true under apartheid, that you divide people, right? And you create incentives such that the situation generates evil action, irrespective of individuals' desires. It structurally promotes evil, if you like. In fact, you can be quite well-meaning, generous person, if you like, and still tend to evil action in such a situation. That's right. Your example, the concentration camps, seems a limiting case of that, right? There's almost nothing you can do in that situation which will allow you to come out of it morally whole, morally clean. Yeah, the very situation you're placed in is sullying morally. And there's a very interesting book recently by Lisa Tessman called "When Doing the Right Thing is Impossible." I think that's what it's called. And her argument is that there are certain situations, certain contexts of action, which preclude making possible right action. And all you're faced with are various degrees of evil. Yeah.
So Mark mentioned the movie Saw, and as someone who loves horror movies and writes horror fiction, I'm very curious what your view is on people reveling in or enjoying books like Stephen King's or horror movies, where these evils are happening on screen, and our reaction is one of delight. And maybe fear along with the characters, but enjoying that fear, kind of a deliciousness associated with it. I wonder whether that is evil on your view.
I mean, it shades into aesthetic theory, doesn't it? Kant has a view on this. Kant has a view on everything. So, I mean, just retell his view, which is that he didn't put it so much in terms of good and evil, but of the phenomenon of the sublime, where we are confronted with an event, say a thunderstorm, which threatens human life. But as long as we are insulated from the storm and we are at a distance from it, we can in some sense appreciate it and enjoy it. So there's as it were, an important aspect here of distance from reality. Once that distance is in place, we react very differently. And I think that must be true to a large extent of horror films. If we are actually in the room with the Saw guy and he was going for us, we wouldn't be laughing. We wouldn't be enjoying it at all. I think it's more complex than enjoyment. I think it is, as you said, enjoying the fear, partly. And the enjoyment is partly conditioned by the fact that we know it won't have the usual effects. Right, so what we're fearing won't have the usual effects on us that the objects of fear do. So it's partly an enjoyment of safety amid fearful stimuli, and that obviously is not evil as such. What might be evil is an enjoyment of things being done to others, which we wouldn't want done to us. A kind of vicarious feeling, I suppose. And that touches on things which are very, very deep in our psyche. I'm not sure I've thought very much about that, but it seems to me that life is so full of threats, especially as we are experiencing now through disease, that to see other people getting in the neck rather than us is, at one level, gratifying because we've escaped the threat. And that aspect of us, which is deeply callous and seeks to save our own skin above all else, does find that gratifying, I think.
I read listened actually to an audio book recording of Stephen King's The Bazaar of Bad Dreams, which is a collection of his short stories. And between each story, he gives a discussion himself in his own voice, in his own words, of how that story came to be and on writing horror generally. And he said something, I've been writing horror for years. I'm a sci-fi horror writer. And he said something which totally changed the way I understood horror. And he said, horror is deeply funny. Deeply funny. And I found that, and he said, it's the humor that we find in watching terrible things happen to people that is horrifying to us. We want to laugh and are horrified by our own reaction.
We're horrified by our own reaction when we laugh.
Yeah.
So, okay. So it's not just that we find horror funny, but there's a kind of meta reaction, yeah. Maybe, but I have the feeling that would be peculiar to a certain character. I mean, I don't think I've experienced that. Maybe because I haven't been exposed to enough horror films or stories.
Yeah, so there's certain people that enjoy horror and certain people that don't. Not everyone likes horror, and I think it might be that the people who enjoy horror find it funny, and the people who don't look at it and say, "But why would you enjoy this?" And I wonder whether that says something about who we are as a species or as humans, in terms of kind of some root in us, something in us that revels you talked earlier about reveling in the safety of this not happening to us.
Yes.
But I wonder whether there's something more sinister there as well, kind of a sadism.
Finding something funny, amusing, is slightly different from finding it gratifying. When I've laughed and the audience has laughed next to me, it's because the effects were so badly done. So what was actually funny was that you couldn't take it seriously as horror.
It was bad horror. That's why it was
bad horror. It was badly
Right.
done. It was badly acted. It was badly staged, etc. Yeah. So the source of the humor was something that was, to one side of what should be happening. Finding horror itself, when well done, well staged, etc., funny, that I think is shading into what you just called sadism.
So let's imagine a couple of cases. So let's say you have the Mother Teresa type who spends their time, toiling to reduce suffering. And now Mother Teresa herself has a complicated actual history, but let's imagine the glorified version of Mother Teresa. So you're mopping the brows of the sick. You're trying to do as much good in the world as possible. But in your spare time, what you do to sort of fuel yourself is read the most sadistic novels, play the most violent video games, indulge in the most lurid sexual fantasies. Now, it'd be interesting to think of, is this person doing anything evil at all, given that it has, let's say, only positive consequences. So the more they read about, pulling people's toenails off, the more it makes them sort of, and they delight in it and enjoy it and, kind of imagine themselves doing it. But in practice, it just fuels them to sort of, heal the sick and do all these good things in the world. Would we think anything?
That's how it fuels them? How does it encourage them?
So it might be that, you could be the kind of person who's psychologically disposed that way. So you might sort of say that, whenever you're with the sick, you feel some kind of disgust for them. But because you have this fantasy realm where you can imagine punishing them and torturing them, that creates empathy in the real world. So,
Nice.
So it could be some kind of case like that. That the more you sort of, it could be like that your fantasy world is a steam valve for all of your, let's say, your internal vices. So if we think of yourself as this mix, as you set out in the beginning, of good and bad, well, you let all the bad out in the fantasy realm, and then the good can really sort of come out in the, in the real world.
Yeah. Yes. Well, there might be some kind of psychological mechanism like that in some people, at least. So the question is whether that could be justified, or.
Well, I mean, I want to make, in other words, not a psychological assessment, but a philosophical assessment, which is to work out, well, if someone is that way, or that is how they work, should we, in other words, say, well, they're doing the right thing. They should read more and more of that kind of literature and fantasize more and more because it seems to have these wonderful consequences. Or do we say, no, you should stop doing that, even if it will have some negative effects in the world, you'll be less kind, less giving in reality, because we think there's something intrinsically wrong with this kind of thought.
That's a very good question, because really it's getting to the heart of the issue I had, which is evil a characteristic of our actions, in which case it's fine because the moral saint, the Mother Teresa, does the right thing all the time, right? Or is it a feature of our character, in which case it's a bit of a problem because our character is being filled by these thoughts? Or is it a feature just of our thoughts at all? Not even our character as leads to action, but just our very thoughts, the things in our head. If those are problematic, does that make us evil? And I think it's a very good case, because it's asking you, Tom, to pick out which of these is the feature for evil.
Well, I think, as in the narrow utilitarian would say, that whatever it takes to generate the good consequences, that's okay. But is that really how we think about these things? I think that, say you were being treated by this slightly deranged Mother Teresa figure, who you knew could only treat you well in virtue of this strange psychological or doing weird stuff at night before she sees you. I'm not so sure you take as kindly to her treatment. I'm not sure your whole view of her and her actions, in a way, is sullied by that.
I'll give you a really good real life case.
Yeah.
You go to the hospital, you've got corona, and there are two doctors. And the one is just the loveliest teddy bear, and he cares about you so much, and he's so empathetic. And he's an average doctor in terms of ability. And the other one is a psychopath. He cares nothing for your well-being whatsoever. He cares only about his reputation. All he wants is to be viewed as the best possible doctor. And because of that, he is actually a fantastic doctor. And your likelihood of survival is increased if you go to him, the psychopath. Who do you pick?
You said he was an excellent doctor. I demur at that description. I think the upshots of his actions might be good for you. I wouldn't say he's an excellent doctor, though. We wouldn't wish our doctors to be like that, given a choice. If it was a choice between him and no good upshots, then I think we'd choose him. Yeah, but that's one thing to say, to finesse the description of what a doctor is. But in terms of actual human psychology, right, this depends quite strongly on your hypothesis about him. I don't think that hypothesis would ever really apply.
Well, there's good data to suggest it. So you find high prevalences of psychopaths among surgeons, for example. And there's a view that the reason why they do it is as I've described. They do it for their self-glorification. They like it's a hard task to do. They might even be fascinated by what they're doing, cutting you up, having an intimate relation with your body. And because of that, they are really, really good surgeons. Now, I wonder why I've set this up in this way is if you say, okay, look, I really would prefer it if my doctor were this wonderful human being who was doing it because they care about me and they love me. And maybe they're less technically good. And you want to kind of boil in this idea that, well, a good doctor means having these other character traits like being empathetic and kind. And so all I want to do is say, okay, we've got the character traits and we've got the technical ability. How much technical ability are you willing to, push down for those nice empathetic character traits? If I tell you, well, look, your chances of dying at the hands of the lovely teddy bear go up by 10%. Do you say, I'll take that deal? That's fine. I want the teddy bear. Or what if? How much do I have to push you before you say, give me the psychopath? I don't care that he despises me. I know I'm going to survive at the end of this operation or the end of this corona treatment.
Well, at least I know I have a better chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this approach is one often taken in moral theory. It's a typical consequentialist approach where you weigh up factors and say, measure one and against the other, and how much are we willing to withstand a deficit along a certain dimension. I would view things a bit differently. I'd say, what is it to be a doctor? How do we want to train doctors? What kind of incentives do we want to bring to bear? So, do you think it's actually, well, I wouldn't say common, but not uncommon for surgeons to go into surgery, train for years and years and years, just because they have some kind of fascination with cutting people up and want a good reputation?
I can believe it. I can believe it.
It's logically possible.
I can certainly imagine individual cases, right? We can imagine that it's a few people at least.
Yeah. Look, I think those kind of cases were realized very clearly, again, in sort of the paradigm of evil, the Nazi case, where there were medical experiments done by people who cared nothing about their patients, and the upshots were interesting, perhaps, for medical science. That kind of case seems to me to have existed, to been clear, but we tend to repudiate that whole episode in history and say that these weren't real doctors, and we wouldn't want to train anybody to have those attitudes, dispositions.
Well, there seems to be a distinction. So in other words, your Dr. Mengele case, you have someone that is they're not aiming to heal the patient. What they're aiming to do is, let's say, make scientific discoveries, and and they don't care about the patient, so they're happy to torture that person to death. The kind that I'm talking about is someone who says, I don't care about them in and of themselves, but I do care about their survival because it reflects on me. And so they only have a meta care about it, not for your own sake, but because of, excellent doctors are like this. I mean, you find this, the movie Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is very much like that. He's a sort of psychopathic character.
Doctor Strange Love.
No, it's a Marvel movie.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah. But played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who generally plays those sort of autistic style characters who are, dedicated to their craft. If you think about him in Holmes, it might not be that he cares so much about solving the case, because those people will then be restored to a state of comfort, and he's not motivated by care. He's motivated by the problem solving element. So I mean, you find the similar trait among lawyers. That some of the best lawyers like solving very hard problems. They're not motivated by, well, I just hope that once this problem is solved, people will start feeling better about their lives, and I'm motivated by a sense of compassion and care. They just say, well, it's a really hard problem to solve, and I delight in doing that. So they lack a particular kind of virtue, one of care, but they have this other trait. Let's say one of, we might think of as being vicious. So having a great reputation, but it motivates them to good action. And I think, again, if you're picking lawyers, you want the guy who's going to win, and you might not care what his motivations are.
It's logically possible, once again. I say it's unlikely to be the case in reality in this regard, that when you're treating a patient, you're not just treating a body and interacting with blood vessels, etc. You're actually treating a whole person. So in order to be able to treat that person well, it seems to me that you'd have to have some modicum of psychological acuity and sensitivity, etc. Otherwise, they're going to physically, probably psychosomatically, not be in the state they should be. You're going to increase their tension, their blood pressure, etc., etc. So the care aspect is not merely a dispositional fact about the doctor. It's also a relational fact about how the patient feels.
Let me make it harder for you. So let's assume that you have a Fordian style system, which we do have in hospitals. So let's say you have the person who meets the patient and develops a relationship with them, like your general practitioner who's lovey-dovey. And they say, okay, well, you should go to these experts. And when you get there, the doctor sort of diagnoses you, but they don't really spend much time with you. Typically, surgeons don't. And when they see you, you're unconscious because you've gone to the anesthetist first. And when they treat you like a machine. So they really do. They have no personal relationship with you. They don't get to spend time with you like your GP would. You are a body on a slab. And I gather, people that I know who are surgeons very much think about it in that way. They say, this is a complicated machine and we want to fix it. And they don't do any of the stuff that you imagine from your country doctor who's sort of sewing up your wound and, getting to know you and being a holistic practitioner. They solve problems. And again, the question is so I think we can have very good practical cases for why we could have this in reality, why it might be common. And the question is the moral question, which is that a problem?
Well, I just want to get at what it is that what is the objection to? So is the question, is it evil to be this kind of a surgeon, this kind of a doctor? Or is the question, well, given that it is evil, is it a problem? In other words, is evil so unimportant that we should relegate it to the point where we actually aim for it some of the time?
Earlier it was, he's just in it for his reputation and he doesn't care about the patient at all. He's treating the patient as a kind of machine that needs to be fixed, right? I mean, I would say that the latter kind of case is suboptimal. It's not the best, but in many cases it's probably acceptable, especially if the patient is anesthetized and has no experience of the doctor, right? But it's a slightly different kind of case to the one you were outlining earlier. The trouble is, if someone is completely in a job for their own reputation, for their own kudos, that is, in the long term, unlikely to serve them very well, because they're likely to cut corners and they're likely to basically do a disservice to the patient if they can get away with it, right? So there will be practical upshots in the long term for that kind of person. There won't be a perfect dovetailing between his ego and their well-being.
Yeah, so it seems like the position you have to adopt is one of like some kind of probabilistic account to say, well, it seems to be the case that if you adopt the classical virtues, if you're kind and considerate and caring and warm, that overall you'll probably wind up with better results. Whereas you're inclined to think that the selfish egotist, narcissist probably won't. And then it's just an improvement.
Hang on. So, interestingly, the so-called virtues you listed, none of them are in Aristotle, being warm, considerate, and kind. You won't find any of those on his list. I don't think those are virtues. There may be a question of manner. But the virtue is a bit deeper than that. They do involve competence, like courage, wisdom, justice. So I think they go deeper in their upshots for action. A just doctor, a wise doctor, even a courageous doctor. So there's a certain tendentiousness in your description there, I think. Yeah.
It's a clever response, Tom, because what Aristotle's doing is he's building into the virtues the notion that they will be successful, right? So if Mark's objection is saying, well, I can imagine vices that would be tremendously useful. And I guess that would then very much depend on how you define vices. Because if you define vices in a way which is opposite to the Aristotelian view of virtues, then you're going to define vices in such a way that they inevitably lead to failure. Right. You can kind of see it in his definition of happiness, eudaimonia. It's been a while since I studied Aristotle, so just correct me if I've got the wrong word here. But eudaimonia, if I remember correctly, is basically this idea that happiness is not just a feeling for Aristotle, but it's a kind of a state of being in the world in a successful way. And all that comes with it, right? So, it's very much linked with his notion of virtue, which is going to bring about eudaimonia. The opposite of the corollary, I don't know if it's the corollary or the opposite, but anyway, on the other hand, you've got vices which are going to bring about something opposite to eudaimonia, some sense of failing, suffering and failing.
Yes, that's right. He calls it kakodaimonia, I think. That is bad, having a bad spirit as opposed to a good one. Yeah. Nice you brought that up, because his view of eudaimonia is really the following, that eudaimonia, being happy or being fulfilled, is really reducible to practicing the virtues. So there's nothing over and above that kind of life. So we can actually tell when other people are eudaimon. We just see what kind of life they're living. You don't have to ask them, are you happy? How are you feeling? It's an objective state of being. Now, that's different, you see, from Mark's suggestion of a person who's self-interested. Self-interest, it comes apart quite strongly from eudaimonia, because eudaimonia might require you to do things that are very difficult for you. In the most extreme case, they might require self-sacrifice and giving up your own life. For instance, the soldier who's courageous may have to do that. So eudaimonia is not the same as egoistic self-interest. I just say that by way of clarification, because I think it's an important gap between the way we think about happiness and the way that he would. Yeah.
So you raise an interesting case for me, the courageous soldier. And we can think of two kinds. So there's the one that's in World War I. He's in the trench and a mortar lands there. And he knows it's going to explode within the next 10 seconds. And there are 100 guys there. And he throws himself on top in an act of courage, absorbs the blow, and saves the other 99 soldiers. And we think, this is this supreme act of virtue, of courage. Here's the other case, which is the courageous Gestapo agent. So he takes every risk possible, puts himself in the line of danger so that he can find as many Jews possible to send to the concentration camps. So he, again, puts himself in the line of fire. We think it is a real act of courage, but in service of a very evil cause. And so I wonder if, when we think about virtue, if it is contingent. In other words, we want certain kinds of people to have certain virtues, but when you add them with other kinds of things, we'd prefer it if that Gestapo agent were a massive coward. In other words, at the slightest hint of danger, he cowered away and was, because of this, incredibly unsuccessful at putting Jews into gas chambers.
What that brings out is a certain problem of definition, I think. So Aristotle would say, as against certain modern philosophers, that in order to be courageous, you have to have what he calls a noble aim, a kalon aim. And without that aim, that's a necessary condition of being courageous, right? So the Gestapo obviously is from the beginning ruled out as being courageous because he has systematically the wrong aims. Now, certain modern philosophers have objected to that kind of view, and they think that, for instance, I think the common example is the courageous thief. So you can have a thief who's very, meticulous and pushes his skills very far, and therefore is, by some accounts, courageous, faces danger down, etc., in the pursuit of theft. But of course, that depends on knocking away one of the necessary conditions that Aristotle puts in place. I prefer the ancient definition. It seems to me that it adds something crucial to what the virtues are.
So it sounds very nice on its face. Here's the problem I have, is we're trying to work out what's good. And then you tell me, well, it's when you do good things. So you build in the notion of noble aims. How do I know what a noble aim is? You then tell me, well, it's the thing that's virtuous. So you've got to have some separate account of goodness to know, well, what is it, in other words, to be courageous and seek the good and do the noble. I mean, it's fine. It might very well be the case that virtue ethics doesn't tell us everything, that we need some other account that it's got to kind of sit with. What's the sort of Aristotelian response?
Well, I'm not sure that Aristotle has a very good response, but you've just highlighted why I'm not really a virtue ethicist.
You mean we've been hammering you all this time on virtue ethics and you're not even a virtue ethicist?
Yeah, it's disappointing.
Or you're not a virtue ethicist anymore.
Well, yes, I've just written a paper, it's funny you mention it, called How Virtue Ethics Misses the Mark. And the point of that paper is that you can't do everything with virtue. You can't do everything with one thing in moral theory. You've got to have an array of concepts at your disposal. Seems to me that Mark's absolutely right, that virtue per se is not an exhaustive concept when it comes to theory. And you do need some other resources for telling you what your proper aims are. And those seem to me to rely on concepts which virtue as such does not supply. And I think that's absolutely right.
So, Tom, this is a fascinating discussion, and I think we could go on indefinitely, but I have a question I really want to ask before we go.
Yeah.
And it's a question that relates to what refers to an episode that we recorded recently with Graham Oppie. What we discussed with Graham was this notion of the problem of evil. So when you speak to philosophers about evil, even lay people about evil, they often will immediately in their minds go to the problem of evil, and specifically it's an objection to God. It's an objection to the existence of God, or an objection to theism, which is the view that God exists in the Judeo-Christian type of view. And basically the problem goes like this. It goes, well, if God existed, there would be no evil in the world. Why? Because God is all good, all knowing, and all powerful. So he would know about the evil because he's all knowing. He would want to do something about it because he's all good. And he would do something to stop that evil from occurring because he's all powerful. But there is evil in the world, and so God doesn't exist. That's the argument. But what it relies upon, of course, is some kind of definition of evil. And often in those arguments, we just kind of take for granted what evil is, without really defining it. And I wonder whether this discussion that we've had around what evil is has some impact on this argument from evil against the existence of God.
There isn't a problem of evil for the non-theist. That is, if you have no interest, if for some other reason you're convinced that God doesn't exist, it seems to me, what is the problem with the existence of evil? So it does presuppose theism, and it presupposes a kind of theism, that is the kind that you outlined, which supposes that God has a certain character. Could it be that God alone decides what constitutes evil? That's a view which is often held by divine command theorists, and they say that evil is a function of what God commands and nothing else, whether he forbids it or commands it. I think that view, for what it's worth, it is not plausible, and it's actually not an orthodox view in Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Well, I shouldn't say Islam, I'm not sure about that, but certainly Judaism and Christianity tends to take the view that there are independent criteria for what constitutes evil, independent of God's will, but not independent of God. That is, it's not external to God's creation, right? That the fact that there are evil things are included within God's creation, but he doesn't stipulate, determined by diktat, what those evil things are. Rather, God, as it were, creates the world, and within that creation there are certain things which are evil, and he acknowledges that. He doesn't determine that. So it's complicated, but and I'm not an expert in philosophy of religion, but I would say that divine command theory is not plausible. You do need an independent account of what's good and evil.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. This was a delightful discussion. It's always fun to revel in evil.
It's funny to revel in evil.
Yeah.